Welcome everyone, friends from the past, rivals, and generally everyone who's here. Thank you for coming. I'm sorry we're 1 minute late. We do try and start our first Wednesdays on time, and we will end on time. We know you're very busy, and we do run it as a public meeting, so that I'll get everyone started, but then it's not wait till the end, it's please contribute early, and we want to hear your questions to our panel, get a briefing from them, and if necessary, take issue with them, and by all means enjoy the public discussion. We've decided to break it up into sections, and by all means, influence us as it gets going. But we'd start with Libya, asking about the intervention. Then we're going to also talk specifically about Saudi Arabia in a third section of the evening. But in the middle, we'll talk about Syria, Yemen, and Bahrain together. And we'll look for inside, and we'll look for some foreign policy messages as well. So that's quite enough from me, but welcome everyone, thank you for coming. Now, if I could ask our panel to introduce itself, starting with Faraj, who's on my left, if you'd kindly tell us who you are, although I know you were born in Benghazi.
Yes, I am. My name is Faraj Najem. I'm originally from Benghazi. I've been self-exiled for the last 28 years in this country. I'm a writer, but also a historian. Looked into the tribal makeup of Libya and try to make sense of it, and still trying.
Welcome. Where are you going in 2 weeks?
I'm going to Saudi, well, not 2 weeks. Sunday I'm going to Cairo, then I'm going to Saudi Arabia, which is an interesting place to watch out for, because the rage in the Middle East, I think it's just not going to stop in Libya or Syria or Yemen. It's just going to go on. And this is something that we should really watch for, but also treasure.
Thank you for coming. Noel.
Yes, I've been living and working on the Middle East, on the Middle East for since about 50 years, actually. I did my PhD in Libya when it had a king.
Long time ago.
Yes, I'm chairman of Media Associates, which is a consultancy company. I've been an academic, businessman, and a diplomat.
And I should say your full name is Dr. Noel Brahoni.
That's right.
And your specialism is Yemen because...
Well, I've just written a book on Yemen, which was published last week, right. on southern Yemen.
Right, so you've seen that we've got a pattern here, Libya, Yemen. Now, to yourself, Barak.
Hi, I'm Barak Seener. Alas, in contrast to the other two, there are no patterns that can be drawn. I'm the Middle East Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute and was one of the founders of the Henry Jackson Society that is Westminster based. That was my previous life, but now based at RUSI.
And in your entire life,
yes,
has the West's foreign policy ever been so severely tested for an entire region of the world since the collapse of communism?
I think that now we're facing not only a new landscape in the Middle East, but a moment where new paradigms of thought are going to be constructed in terms of how we're going to perceive and promote foreign policy.
You're saying yes, really, aren't you?
Yes.
That's right. You see, that's what we've got, a foreign policy expert here. We got there, it was a sentence, but we knew what we were. But you're very welcome. Thank you. Now, last time Jane addressed us at the Frontline club, she had a job with The Economist. Jane Kinninmont, where are you now?
I'm now Senior Research Fellow on the Middle East and North Africa programme at Chatham House, a foreign policy-focused think tank based here in London, and I just returned from Kuwait.
Welcome. OK, so bear in mind, it's your turn in just a second, but would you all address, perhaps in a couple of minutes in turn, and where you need to disagree, was the intervention in Libya justified?
I think it was. I think we have a regime which has been, for the last 42 years, a regime that does not like the word democracy. It has denied its people personal freedom, but also development. It has pillaged the country's riches, but also a regime which is not just lethal to its own population. We saw what he did in Lockerbie, UTA, the French airplane over Niger, but also invading Chad, causing too many problems to neighbors, Tunisians, Egyptians, Saudis, a regime that even sponsored a coup in Fiji, which is next to Australia. So it's a regime which is very dangerous. And what's dangerous about the regime, it isn't the father who has set up this regime, it's the 7 sons who have taken over.
And there's a daughter, isn't there?
Well, there is a daughter. Well,
she's not dangerous.
well, she is equally. Well, let's say 7.5. You know.
No, it's just to annoy the women in the room.
Well,
We'll give you the microphone next. Don't worry.
I think women are wonderful, and I don't think she's.
Keep digging.
I think she's a man in a woman's shape, but very dangerous, by the way. And she's the one who said that that Switzerland that treated her brother badly should be nucleared. So that kind of woman that we need to address. But anyhow, it's a very dangerous regime, and it's the danger does not stop with the father, but also it goes on with the sons as well.
And I'm sorry if I appear facetious. When you left the country, was it partly because you feared for your life?
No, I was sponsored to come to study in this country here, but I knew that there was no place for me. If I had stayed in Libya, I would have been either massacred in the Abu Silim prison, or maybe imprisoned or exiled.
Noel, the question is, was the intervention justified?
Yes,
it was.
Yes, I think it was. And we also have the UN and the European and Arab League acquiescence in it, if I put it that way. But I had slight reservations about it, and I had slight reservations about where it's going, because one of the things I've seen, and I say I've seen the regimes established in the Middle East that we're talking about and lived through them, and seen a series of strongmen really creating regimes built around very big security and military systems, co-opting elites beyond it, and the regimes are extremely large and very powerful, and I don't think they will simply collapse because we're intervening. It's a lot of hard work. Look what it took to get Iraq. I mean, that's the sort of scale it required for these regimes to be overthrown. So I think one has to be, yes, it's right, because there's clearly going to be a problem in Benghazi, but I'm not sure where we go from here.
You're not sure?
I'm not sure.
Are you mostly pessimistic about the direction from here?
I am pessimistic simply because I think it's going to be an immensely difficult task, I think, unless the pressure is such that that people start peeling off the regime.
I think that it was legitimate not due to consensus, but because the legitimacy derives from the human rights considerations in and of itself. I don't think endless, boring legal processes is a legitimizer. Perhaps post facto one can always tap into it to bolster one's position, but as a very simple human being with a regard for human rights, that kind of speaks for itself. And we can't go around saying the mantra that politics is not local but global and avert your eyes to human rights abuses elsewhere in the world. And
is it significant that there are really no Arab countries supplying military aid in form of the airstrikes? It looks, does it not, like another Western boys' club marching into an Arab country? Well, I think that the Arab support has been largely symbolic. That's my point. But is it a problem for them that they can't... If it's such about human rights, why is there no human rights protection from Arab countries? Because human rights values does not emanate from Arab countries. It emanates from Western liberal countries. So it would be bizarre if repressive leaders in the Arab world would be applying a human rights rationale for a no-fly zone in Libya. And I'm coming to you next in the room. You might want to take issue with what you're hearing from everyone. To you, Jane, is it justified? Is it justified intervention? Well, I feel after hearing everyone else that I should say no for the sake of balance. Unfortunately, reluctantly, I would say that I think this was a clear-cut case of humanitarian intervention, if ever you can have one. However, I think we do still need to worry. I'm not so sure that the West's records on supporting human rights in the Arab world is at all convincing. It is not very long since we were allies with Gaddafi and selling him weapons. So I do think there should be more of a focus on not propping up the Gaddafis and the Saddam Husseins of the future. Artillery, computers, combat shotguns, tear gas, military cargo vehicles, ground vehicle, military communications. This is what we sold to Gaddafi. Command communications, control and intelligence equipment, infrared and thermal imaging technology, crowd control ammunition and small arms ammunition. Who made that policy in London? I mean, who are the people who make this? I thought the Foreign Office was meant to be largely a sort of Arabist run, but clearly it's not, is it?
Well, I mean, this was part of the overall deal with bringing Gaddafi back into the fold several years ago.
Selling him crowd control technology.
And I'm certainly not here to defend that, but there was an argument made that as a price for giving up his nuclear programme, he would then be able to have normal relations with the West, including buying arms.
So do you think we traded his denial of nuclear technology with lots of ways to control his population, new weapons, infrared, that wasn't available to him a few years ago?
No, I wouldn't look at the question that way at all. I mean, I think it was a major deal to get the WND removed from Libya. And
a success of Western foreign policy.
A success, yeah.
OK, now,
yes,
please do, yes.
I think that an Arabist Foreign Office, if you want to call it that, doesn't at all contradict cozying up to dictators in the Middle East.
OK, we're just getting started. To you, then, don't look at it. Please talk into it real very well.
Just because we talk about patents and so on, I think the story with the government policy on supplying regimes with stuff kind of repeats itself, because similar stuff happened in Iran. UK supported the Shah. They sold CS gas to crowd control and so on. That's why this is kind of second time, at least from my knowledge, happens there. That's why.
You're not surprised by it?
No.
Right. Could you pass it to this gentleman here?
Hello, Richard Tebbuth. I think we're all concerned about mission creep. How will we know when we have mission accomplished in Libya? And just an aside on another statement you said, the UNHRC, should there be any Arab seats on that council?
Right, let's break it up. Two questions. When will we know? Let's take it in order. When will we know first on the mission accomplished, Faraj?
I think with Gaddafi's gun, this is when obviously we know that the regime is the mission is done, is accomplished. Just going back to the supplying Gaddafi with arms and to twin it with your question, to accomplish the mission, I think we need to arm the opposition, the interim government, the legitimate government. The government now speaks for these people in Benghazi. They're not asking for boots in the ground. They said, okay, well, you've stopped Gaddafi's using his airplanes and so on. Now we can ask for arms to defend ourselves, or to free our brothers in Misrata and Tripoli to rise up peacefully and speak their minds. So it's people here wanting arms, rather than in the old times, despotic regimes procuring arms using people's money. So this is what we need to do.
I think you're asking about mission creep, because that's not in UN 1973, is it? So why do you want them to remove Gaddafi?
Well, the whole thing, this revolution, this uprising, it's all about regime change.
No, it's not. It's about protecting civilians.
Well, the civilians wanted to change the regime.
But it's not in the UN resolution.
No, but you need to defend us to change the man, to get rid of him.
No,
it's as simple as that.
Well, I think the question you asked is the right one. I mean, the UN resolution is very clear: it's to protect civilians, and I don't know when we're going to achieve that. We won't know. Well, ideal regime change would be the answer perhaps most people want, but I don't know whether that's achievable. Certainly in the short term.
If the rebels are attacking Tripoli,
yes,
civilians will need protection.
Yes.
Well, the rebels, they're not saying that we're going to attack Tripoli. They're going to stop Gaddafi's brigades from coercing people from coming out to the street and speaking their mind. After all, these oppositions, they were peaceful protesters. They came out, with no arms whatsoever, and Gaddafi, he's the one who started shooting at them.
Let's hear from the two other panel members. You keep the microphone. To you, Barak.
You can't have it both ways. You can't worship at the altar of consensus in the same way that President Obama does, and at the same time have coherence. If you look at Resolution 1970 and 1973, it's essentially a fudge in order to create the lowest common denominator for all actors in the international community. The problem with it is, how do you define protecting the civilians? Is protecting the civilians decapitating the Gaddafi regime? Because you could argue quite convincingly that the mere existence of the Gaddafi regime poses a mortal threat to the civilians.
Would you argue that?
I would argue that.
You?
But the problem is that consensus allows for mission creep, because it can be protracted and endless, and the tragedy is that in the not too distant future, people will look at the no-fly zone and delegitimise the no-fly zone itself because of what consensus in international law has created.
Jane, then you can come back.
I guess I'm not so anti-consensus. I think it probably is better being done in this way than being a purely sort of US operation. I do think the lack of consensus on the issue of regime change is a real problem. I mean, you mentioned one possible scenario about the rebels attacking Tripoli. What if there's another kind of scenario where you have a protracted stalemate? Where's the end game? Where's the exit strategy? Clearly, you know, some members of the coalition, particularly the US, do want regime change, but they don't have a legal basis for it.
And you've got questions, but he wants answers from you, Jane. When do we know if it's mission accomplished?
I don't think it will be clear. I think there will be arguments over it, because I think if we did have some kind of stalemate, you would have some people arguing mission is not accomplished because we haven't actually taken out Gaddafi and he is a threat. Others would argue otherwise. The consensus would break down.
So it's another black hole, like Iraq, Afghanistan. We go on and on.
No, but for the opposite reasons.
Okay, in turn, 1, 2, 3. Yep.
For the opposite reasons of Iraq, because Iraq didn't have consensus, and that was a black hole. Here, it's precisely because of the consensus that you have the black hole.
Iraq, you had communities within Iraq fighting each other, and there was no consensus. In Libya, in the Arab world, in the Islamic world, in the West, this is a consensus that we should celebrate. I mean, we've never had a consensus like this. I mean, God would be very happy to have a consensus like this. You know, it's wonderful.
Yeah, I wonder if it's a negative consensus. It's when things get more difficult in 3 to 6 months' time whether the consensus will remain. That's my concern.
Thank you for your question. And to you.
Hello, my name is Pablo, and I'm a blogger. I'd like to go back to the consensus. I think taking it one step before, why did the Security Council vote the way it did when we knew that countries like United States, UK were already involved in 2 unhumanitarian wars in Iraq and Afghanistan? We knew that France was interested in getting involved in some kind of action, which is what is happening now. We get Russia that had the situation in Chechnya, which was also an anti-humanitarian situation. So I think we have to go there to understand why this is happening, in particular because it has to do with the New World Order, which is also a subject of this meeting.
Yes.
And I wonder if the New World Order is designed to eliminate these small regimes that pose a threat to the people that are voting in the Security Council.
Right, Pablo, I wonder if the room will allow me to take your question as the opportunity to move on to ask because the second bit we were going to ask about was the criteria that the panel's been discussing. Does it apply in Syria, Yemen or Bahrain? And I wonder if you agree that at 7:20 you're moving us along. We haven't discussed Saudi Arabia. So I'm going to take you as an opportunity. I think Pablo's saying, if you're also excited about the Libyan consensus, is it going to be intervention in Syria? Is it going to be intervention in Yemen or Bahrain? Is that fair? Is that the area you're in?
Yeah, because we are talking about, I think, we are talking about a world order, since it's the first time that the people that were in the past against each other seem now to be agreeing in attacking other countries.
Okay, right. So will you tell us the possibility, if given what you've said about Libya? Could I start with you, Noel? What's the possibility of intervention in Syria, Yemen or Bahrain?
I'd have thought no, probably. I think it's important, and it's very important, I think, this whole debate, to remember that we're talking about a number of 19, 20 different countries, and they're all different. And the pace of the events in each country will be different, and the trajectories will be different. I think Saudi Arabia, for example, we'll come on to that, but it can be very, very, very slow. And in a sense, it's also, there was a consensus on Libya, and there was a very clear situation. I don't know whether we'll see the same in Yemen. Yemen is a country I know very well. You've got the regime, you've got the opposition parties, you've got the people in the streets, you've got the Southerners, you've got the Al-Houthi. They all unite in wanting to overthrow Salah, but they're very divided amongst themselves, and anything there would be very, very messy indeed. Syria is a very, very strong regime. It's been there for a very long time, and it'll have to react to in some way to what's going to happen, and I hope that we can deal with that through diplomatic and other pressure, because I think that they're all learning, I think, the regimes from each other of what is happening. That's why one is seeing these economic concessions being made and these promises of political change. I mean, President Assad has promised some change to the emergency law, a new emergency law. I think it's going to be announced tomorrow. But,
Jane?
Yep, I think it's a completely different case in every single country, and I don't think the opposition movements in these other countries are calling for Western military intervention in any way, but definitely in both Yemen and Bahrain, the opposition are asking why the West doesn't really seem to be doing anything to rein in their government's response to them.
And what's your view? Why do you think that's the case? Given what everyone said on the panel about Libya, why is the West doing nothing in Libya and Bahrain? In Yemen and Bahrain? Is it a fair criticism?
I think it is, yeah. I mean, I think in the case of Bahrain, basically Saudi Arabia sees the uprising in Bahrain as a direct challenge to its own national security. The West's newfound love for democracy in the Middle East doesn't really extend to the Gulf, particularly Saudi Arabia, where the old oil interest still holds sway. In Yemen, I think the West is caught more on the back foot. It's been backing Saleh probably for too long. It doesn't quite know what to do next. But the Gulf countries are now talking about mediation there.
Barak?
I think that just like what you said, every country is very different, and you can't simplistically just draw a common denominator between them. Yemen is like kaleidoscopic in its opposition movements, and it's a vacuum of governance. Bahrain is a bulwark against Iran for strategic interests, and I think that policy can be identified in a triad manner. For example, you need to have a fusion of ideals, capacity and strategic interests. You can't be overstretched. It needs to fit into your strategic interests and your ideals. So let's say, hypothetically, you have the luxury of creating a hit list of evil regimes around the world, right? North Korea, Syria, Iran, etc., etc. There's tons of them, right? And you have to be pragmatic. What do your resources allow for? Does it fit into your strategic interests? And, you know, God willing, you go on to that sequence and you eliminate one by one. If it was such an orderly world, but alas, it's not.
I think Yemen will be problematic because Yemen has sectarian communities. there is a clear split between south and north. So it is going to be problematic not just for the world but also for the neighboring countries. As for Bahrain, there is a worry, there's a genuine worry that Bahrain might swing towards Iran, who is the enemy of the Gulf state but also the West. Syria, if Syria changes, obviously people are fearing that Syria will be even more radical than what it is right now, especially when it comes to Israel.
Good evening. Ibrahim Al-Mayed from the Libyan British Relations Council. I would like to go back to something that Dr. Noel said in his introduction, that these strongmen regimes with very strong security around them and very well established, they do not necessarily fall when you take out the leader.
Please use the microphone, would you?
Sorry, yeah. And that's what we're seeing now potentially in Egypt, where the army are in power and elements of the regime are still there, even though Mubarak has been taken out. But we cannot say there is one rule for all the countries in the Middle East and North Africa. Libya is very different. Colonel Gaddafi is the center and focus of his regime, and the removal of Gaddafi will cause the regime to unravel. Now, moving on from that point will be a long and difficult challenge, a difficult road. But the Libyan people stood up for freedom. They want the freedom that has been denied them for so many years, and they want to live in a democratic society. So in the case of Libya, the removal of Gaddafi will cause the unraveling of the regime.
But that's not what the UN's authorised.
No, but it does. The fact does remain.
No, but that's your view is no, but. So we can take people away we don't like them. We can do that, can we?
The UN resolution allows for the protection of the civilian population in Libya. The only threat to the population of Libya is the Gaddafi regime.
He's addressing to you, I think, here.
Oh, right, yes, OK. Well, I take... well, if you're going back to the one-man point, yes, I mean, perhaps Libya, you could accept that, but there's the Praetorian Guard, there's the army, the security services, the Khamis battalions. This is all part of that sort of regime. And within all these regimes, there are interest groups which believe in the survival. Their own survival depends on the survival of the regime. So I think that in many cases they will fight. They may not. I mean, if Gaddafi were removed, it might, well, in Libya.
It's likely that a lot of that infrastructure will unravel.
Yes, it might.
Gaddafi has been paranoid of an attempted overthrow from the army and has systematically weakened the Libyan army over decades. So it's not the same as in Egypt.
I think if Gaddafi goes, Libya will be a good model for the Middle East. Libya is a very cohesive, very homogeneous society. Gaddafi has succeeded in one thing, has cemented Libyans against him. You know, people in the East, for example, who are being accused of being separatists and so on, are eager to see Tripoli, the capital, liberated, and they said we will not celebrate unless the West is freed from Gaddafi. So there is a genuine consensus on the removal of this man, and this could be a good example to follow in the future.
Right, to you here, and to you at the back in a minute.
Hi everybody, my name is Ahmed Suwalim. I'm originally from Benghazi, and I just, going back to the point, when is the end game? I think the end game has to be, and I'm talking not because of the Libyan civilians or the Libyan population, I'm talking about humanity. This man has proven every now and then that he's a threat to the world. And I say this to my British fellow citizens and the French and the Americans. If this person stays, he will not be a threat to the Libyans. He will target everyone who sided by the Libyan people. So when I say is, if people are questioning when is the end game, it has to be the end of this person. And I mean, not even by taking him aside, it's taking his people around him, his kids and his regime altogether.
I think Resolution 1973 can include decapitating the Gaddafi regime itself, because only somebody who is retarded will look at that resolution and say it's simply to, in a symptomatic manner, protect civilian populations that are threatened imminently by an armoured column that is venturing towards it.
Jane,
but do you think really that the 10 governments that said yes all did interpret it in that way and thought they were giving a mandate for Gaddafi to be assassinated?
I think each country interpreted it differently, and within each country they interpreted it differently, just like Cameron and Liam Fox and the head of the British Armed Forces. They all had their own interpretation. So that's the beauty of international law. It's fudge, and you can rationalise it post facto however you like.
Jane, would you like to come back?
I think that's it really. I'm not. Yes. I think that damaging the consensus will be a problem.
There was no consensus. Anyway, let's be frank. The Arab League, after 12 hours of it being put together, criticised the action that the alliance made, even though they knew damn well that Resolution 1973 entailed taking out Gaddafi's air defence systems. They knew what that meant. The African Union's been screaming out against it. Turkey. There's no real...
World leaders made it very clear that Gaddafi must go. I mean, Obama, when he was in Brazil, he said it's our policy that this man should go. David Cameron said it, Sarkozy said it. Even the Turks. Mr. Gül yesterday, when he was in Indonesia, he said Gaddafi, he has no place in today's world. So, and the Arabs, there is a consensus that this man must go.
We must talk about the perceived cynicism of this foreign policy in a moment, but I'm taking the lead from you, remember. So if you don't raise it, I'm going to blame you at the end, not me.
I'm William Bache, and I'm one of the cynics. I think the correlation between human rights in the West relates to oil. There's no oil in Syria, so Syrian human rights, well, minimal, I think. It's a pipeline area, though. So I think it's unlikely that the Western countries will take advantage of the situation. But it's a serious interest to Turkey and Israel, because if the new black hole becomes Syria, and Syria implodes, and the West is not going to go in, who's going to go in? The Turks go in, and that'll be the new Israeli neighbor? Or the Israelis go in, that'd be the new Turkish neighbor? Or could the Iraqis even see in their interest, particularly if an al-Qaeda threat comes back out of Syria?
Okay, and to you at the back?
Hi. This is Penner. So during the time when the uprising was happening on Tahrir Square, William Hague went over to the Middle East and to the region, and he went over to Bahrain and met with the King of Bahrain. And he came back and said, actually, King of Bahrain and the family is a good friend of United Kingdom, and also, quote unquote, he said that their views are very much our views. Since then, of course, people have been put down, and there's been an uprising which has been crushed, and the King of Bahrain has invited the GCC to come over and help with putting down the people and what is perceived to be a largely Shia uprising.
And your point?
The point is, the question is to the panel is, what does that mean about the morality of our foreign policy and the new world order?
Do keep the microphone. Sorry to be a bit rude to you. I think it's obviously a question we must address. You're comparing everything and asking about morality. Will you go further, give us your view? What's your answer to your own question?
Well, my hypothesis is that it kind of very much depends. Everybody has a foreign policy interest, and they try to implement that. And in the middle, we are trying to kind of dress it up by democracy and freedom and such principles that people kind of appeals to people. But foreign policy makers don't necessarily believe in it, because if there isn't oil there, or if the interests don't necessarily resonate, well, we're not going to do anything about it, not even go as far as criticizing it in words.
Barak, I think you've come the closest to saying it's simply about our interests. It's not about our values.
I said it's a fusion of all the three things.
You did say that.
And you know, when you look at Bahrain, you can't simply look at the Middle East and think, right, there's an uprising going on throughout the Middle East. It's all location-specific. And with Bahrain, I wonder the extent of Iranian involvement there. And if there is Iranian involvement, it's not simply a bunch of tree huggers that want rights. This is about Iran attempting to extend its sphere of influence. So we can't overlook that. And we can't simply look at it from the present moment in time. I think that Western governments have been wanting, not simply because they've maintained the status quo, but they haven't had a transformational approach towards the Middle East and sought to promote liberalisation, forget democratisation. And it's really ironic. All those who were against regime change under the Bush administration, calling it really colonialistic and imperialistic and every other istic word that existed, none of them, and they were the ones that said you need to foster organic liberal change. They are the ones who today have slashed funds to the opposition movements across the Middle East, whether it be through Egypt to Iran. So I think that whereas we talk the whole time about winning hearts and minds throughout the Middle East, it's actually Iran that's exploiting the fissures and seeking to extend its sphere of influence. This is a failed, not flawed, but failed policy.
There is a double standard, certainly. I think most governments and most movements, though, have been showing some double standards. I might allude to the speech of Hassan Nasrallah, where he praised the uprising in Bahrain, along with those in Libya, Tunisia and Egypt, but he's remained pretty silent on the issue of Syria. But I would like to take issue with the views of both the speakers expressed that the issue here is Bahrain being a bulwark against Iran. I've covered Bahrain for a few years. I'm writing a book about the country. The mainstream Shia opposition in Bahrain looks to Ayatollah Sistani in Iraq rather than looking to Iran. The party that got 62% of the popular vote in the last election has been consistently calling for a constitutional monarchy, a stronger parliament, an elected prime minister. Since the violence happened in February, more radical opposition groups that do look more towards Fadlallah and towards Khamenei have been calling for an outright revolution. They have not represented the majority Shia population in Bahrain in the past. I think there is a concern that as this quite sectarian crackdown continues, more people could join that radical path. I would also add that the crackdown has included also the arrest of the most prominent Sunni opposition politician in Bahrain, who has been detained now for 2 weeks with his family, not knowing what charges there are against him, not knowing where he's detained. So I think that there are genuine human rights concerns that the West should be making more of a fuss about.
And how do you join the dots? Do you wish that it wasn't double standards, or is that so childish and naive you're telling us to get on with it as it is?
I think it's understandable that countries pursue their interests, but they have to look hard at how those interests are constructed and to bear in mind that the leaders that they currently deal with may not be there forever. I mean, the US has its major naval base in Bahrain, so it wants to have good relations with the government. But is it really good if a large proportion of the population sees the US as complicit in a crackdown against it?
Okay, and to you with the tie.
Yes, going back to the 1970 and 1973 resolutions and their focus on protecting civilians, shouldn't there are human rights abuses in Tripoli right now, happening right now, and people are in danger in Tripoli and the Western Mountain? Shouldn't that be considered part of protecting civilians in Libya? They're not being bombarded, they're not being shelled, but they're being kidnapped, they're being imprisoned, they're being shot. It's all happening in Tripoli as well as other Western areas in Libya. Shouldn't the protection of this resolution extend to those people?
Yes, definitely, I would agree with you, and this is why I say that the resolution implies 1973 implies that Gaddafi should be removed. This is the only way to secure the human rights of those people in the West that you've mentioned.
We're repeating ourselves a bit.
Yes.
Does anyone disagree on the panel? No. You, and then you, sir. You're next.
My apologies. My question actually related to the earlier discussion, but
it moves very quickly up here, you know.
Yeah, sorry about that.
It better be good, this question.
In terms of the longer-term issues, one of the issues that could come up is the fact that Libya and many other Middle Eastern countries have very little history or culture of democracy, and if you compare it to the current situation in Ivory Coast, a country which similarly has had a very short history of having any democratic government, do you think that the removal of Gaddafi will necessitate a successful democratic country? Or could he just be replaced with another strong man, or turn to be a corrupt or broken democratic regime?
No?
Well, I think, in the particular case of Libya, I think if you remove that regime, then the trouble is he's really destroyed everything else. And in other countries, you do have potential institutions. It's difficult to see what will come in Libya, except what's coming from the street now. And maybe the technocrats and the people in exile that might be able to go back. But the particular way Libya's been run through this basic People's Council, General People's Council, it lacks any institution. So I don't see I think whatever's going to happen is going to be very difficult. It's going to be a difficult coalition, very difficult to get people together. I mean, I'm sure my friend here would like to comment on that.
Obviously, I follow the situation in Libya very closely. Over the last 5 weeks, it's amazing how things evolved. For example, in the east, in Benghazi in particular, spontaneous demonstrations, people speaking their mind, newspapers, even the man who's now been charged with the media, the Ministry of Media. He said once Gaddafi is removed, I'm going to resign because we're not going to have a minister. We're just going to have free media. So the democratic fever is catching on, and people are learning very. We live in new age whereby we interact with each other quicker. Because don't forget this revolution started with Twitter and Facebook by young people. So it's catching on. I didn't think it would be a problem at all.
It's still be organised. I mean, this is it's difficult. I think you're finding in Yemen. There are 31 different groups in the street. They formed a coalition in Egypt. You've got this coalition, and it was the revolutionists in Egypt were advocating voting against the referendum on constitutional change, so they could have time to recognise. And it was 77% of the Egyptian population actually voted against that. That's another interesting point in terms of the demographics of the region. How representative are the people running the revolution?
I think it's really remarkable that when in the initial stages of the uprising against Gaddafi, everybody said, "Oh my God, what a fissured society! Gaddafi successfully created divide and rule tactics, and he spent all his time doing that against tribal leaders. And once he goes, it's going to be a civil war like Somalia." And I found it really fascinating to see how the rebel leaders, the Transitional National Council, sought to create a robust civil society and societal cohesion in the law courts in Benghazi. And I think that the only option that the West has is to establish contact groups with the tribal leaders, with the Transitional National Council, not only to create a coherent strategy for them, but in order to inculcate liberal values for them. And perhaps in the future, if we arm the rebels, there ought to be strings attached as to what types of ethos do they seek to embrace.
Right, we'll come back to Libya at the end, unless your questions about Libya, then we're moving on to Saudi Arabia.
Just a small talk. Let us take the West as a lecturer or teacher, telling us day and night that Ben Ali, Hosni Mubarak, Al Abdullah Saleh, they are the best people, they are the nicest people, they are fighting with us terrorism, blah, 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 blah. And then suddenly overnight you tell us that they are hell, we want democracy, we want rule of the law. And then sometimes you tell us, the United Nations, what they did is short of, they are not asking Gaddafi to go, we cannot. We are confused in the area. This is a terrible double standard.
Yeah.
Every now and then you are coming with a new story. We are not believing you. This is the problem.
And what's the standard of the Arab world? They don't like it, but they don't want to do anything about it. Is that right?
Well, I doubt very much if the present people who are in Tahrir or in Tunisia or wherever, they will be friends of the West. Look, one example. When Clinton went to Cairo to visit the Tahrir Square, she didn't find any. Why?
Okay.
This is the question.
I'd like to come back on that.
Please do. Keep the microphone. Have a go.
The week before last, I've got my own, but the week before last I was in Cairo interviewing a lot of young activists from different political groups, and one of the questions I was asking in my research is, what role do you think the West should play here, if any role at all? And actually I think a lot of people still want to engage with the West. For instance, the Muslim Brotherhood were very unhappy that David Cameron did not meet with them during his visit, because they did actually want to meet with him, but they want the engagement to be on completely different terms. Some of them would like to see an apology from the West. Certainly they would like to see Western support in hunting down the assets that have been taken from Egypt and returning those to the state, and they want more of an equal say.
Should there be an apology, Barak, from the West?
I think that the problem with the West is, I actually don't know how to answer the question, because the West is very much in a position of damned if you do, damned if you don't, because you've got two approaches you can adopt: stability or transformation. The stability is propping up and engaging with the elites, with regimes, in order to counter.
Well, they've certainly tried that in the West, haven't they?
But it's not sustainable, and so you'll get criticism. Oh, you're hypocritical. You've not embraced liberal democratic values when you've kept face with these repressive regimes. But then, if you promote transformation, people will criticise you for being a hawk, for being a colonialist. I don't hear from Western populations, let alone the political leadership, what type of ethos should we adopt, and can it be sustained?
Well, what do you think is the answer to that? What would you like? How would you like to see the West behave?
The same rules of law applied here. We want the same rules of law applied over
So you want regime change then?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Way.
Okay, and to you.
Hi, my name is Jassim from Tripoli. I just have one question. If the mission is accomplished next week and Gaddafi is gone, we have too many mercenaries in Libya. What Libyans can do with them?
Okay, who wants to handle that? The NATO will pull out then, won't it?
I think we should send them to the ICC. But also, coming back to the apology, the West should apologize to us or not. I don't think it's the West, it's the various governments. Certainly, I would like to see Tony Blair. He's a man who hugged Gaddafi, rehabilitated him. Again, with Peter Mandelson and people like Gordon Brown, who struck a deal and freed Megrahi and so on. They should come out and tell us why they did it and how much they were earned.
Well, of course, I haven't been a diplomat. I'd have to say this. I mean, you have to deal with what's there. I mean, Mubarak was there 30 years. If we started promoting regime change 25 years ago, what would happen to our interests? I mean, this is the trouble. You have to deal with the governments that are there with, for all your other interests in your region, your policy towards big Middle East issues, and you can't just wish them away. This is the reality of the world.
Well, we'll wrap up.
Yes.
We'll wrap up this in a second.
Yes.
But we're coming to Saudi Arabia. Will you address our friend's question about armed mercenaries in Libya after Gaddafi?
I was in an intelligence briefing. Apparently there's no more than a couple of hundred there. So don't say that they're overrun with mercenaries. There's a couple of hundred.
Is this the same intelligence community who told us about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq? It might be, it might not be, in which case you're lucky. Right, now we're going to move on to Saudi Arabia. If your question's not about Saudi Arabia, then you can't ask it. Now, can I just take a pause here? You've been kind enough to address many different issues, and all of us who've come in the room, we wanted a briefing from inside the country, and we wanted your take on foreign policy. And because I'm about to move on to Saudi, would you tell me the thing that was missing for you didn't get said then, either about the internal situation or about the foreign policy? And if you have said it, please don't feel you have to say anything, because we want to talk about Saudi Arabia. We'll go in this direction. So the question is, did you fail to say something about the countries mentioned or foreign policy? And if this is the time, and then we're moving on.
I'll wait for Saudi.
Thank you.
Wait for Saudi.
Thank you.
Same.
Lovely, I love it. Now, if it's Saudi Arabia, well, we'll come back to you in the closing thoughts, I promise. Man with glasses, I promise. Don't look upset with me, I promise.
Sorry, I'm not flirting with you, but you are the most remarkable moderator.
Okay. So now, we've been running these for a year as public meetings, so believe me, we do rely on our audience. Thank you, I'll take that.
It's the authoritarian approach.
Yeah, no. So now we're moving on to thank you, Saudi Arabia. The question is, well, if we are now pro-democracy, how does our relationship with Saudi Arabia work? And let's go in this direction, and then to you in the room.
Saudi Arabia is a very difficult situation. Saudi Arabia is the way it's governed. It's a deal between the clergy, the tribal, but also the Al Saud family, and it isn't a straightforward case like the way it is in Libya or Egypt or Tunisia. It takes more than what happened in Libya. It's quite a big challenge, but there has to be some sort of reforms.
I have to recognise the way Saudi Arabia is run. I mean, it's surprising there is a consensus system that operates within the ruling family and extends within the elite of the country. And there is a sort of Majlis Ashura, the Constitutional Assembly, which is selected, not elected. But it's a move in the right direction. I don't detect in Saudi Arabia, I mean, I go to Saudi quite a lot, any real movement there that is protesting against it. And where the protests are, there are protest movements, though certainly you've seen them on the internet and elsewhere, and they're both from the liberal side and from the more conservative side. And I'm not sure in which direction, if the reform in Saudi Arabia, which way it would go.
Well, there are civil rights movements, for example, which emanate from within the Islamic but also the Arabic system. For example, they think that it's Islamically acceptable for women to drive cars, but it's tribally not acceptable. So there is this conflict between what's tribal and Islamic, and therefore I think the Saudis, we need to help them, but we cannot really push or impose ourselves on them to create some sort of mechanism whereby Saudi Arabia just modernize and goes forward.
But you told us at the beginning that it's all eyes on Saudi Arabia. It's going to happen there.
It is, because issues such as, for example, women driving is something very big in Saudi Arabia.
I think
and if this happens, I mean, by Saudi standard, I think it's a revolution.
I think it'll be a very long time for anything in Saudi Arabia. I don't think we should assume because something's happened in Tahrir Square or Tunis, it's going to happen everywhere else. So I don't think it will. It may find elements in Saudi Arabia, but it'll take a very, very long time for change.
We can tell that the government in Saudi Arabia has been worried about this risk. If we look at the actions they've taken, the Day of Rage was declared there on, I think, the 11th of March. Police were heavily deployed throughout the major cities. A lot of the regime-supported clerics came out saying protesting is un-Islamic, it will lead to chaos or worse, communism. They, of course, have announced 2 large public spending packages this year already. The first one being 37 billion. They're increasing the size of the religious police, etc. So I think the regime is aware that there's pressure there. They're trying to solve it with economic quick fixes. The fact that the leadership is ageing and they've got their own problems around succession makes it extremely difficult for them to actually reform, and I think that is a worry.
Is a pro-democracy uprising likely in Saudi Arabia?
I don't think so. I think the opposition is too fragmented. I think the liberals and the Islamists are scared of each other, and I think the different regions also have quite different movements of their own. However, we would have said all these things about Tunisia a year ago.
I would agree with your analysis 100%. The problem with it that the United States is doing is it's creating a security architecture which is underpinned by Saudi Arabia. That it has kind of second qualitative edge in the region, but first qualitative edge in the Gulf, and the GCC, with Saudi Arabia underpinning it, is seen as a bulwark against Iran. I think that if the United States is going to be supplying Saudi Saudi Arabia with weapons, it can demand liberalisation, liberal reforms being introduced, and it can pressurise them. I think the greatest threat to Saudi Arabia is not the protests in the street, but the aged leaders that are either ill, demented, or just really old and about to die any minute. But that really is, and there's a succession problem. I think it's the implosion from the leadership, not from the grassroots.
I simply don't agree with that. There is a succession issue because of the ageing leadership, but there's also a process for dealing with it, and I think it's pretty clear who's going to come next, and fairly clear who's going to come after it. I mean, and there is a consensus. I mean, it's important to keep in mind there is a consensus within Saudi Arabia. It's a consensus set by the king. So in that sense, not suggesting it's democratic, but it's set by the king, and the personality of the king may well affect whether it's more liberal or more conservative. It could go in that direction or this direction. But I think there's a consensus within the family and within the elite about the general direction. And I agree entirely. I think they were. I think these are preemptive measures. I think they saw what was happening around the region and took preemptive measures, particularly to deal with the sort of thing, the economic problems we haven't talked about. Because Saudi university lecturers have been saying to me for years, you know, we are seeing the youth bulge coming through the universities, and what we're worried is what's going to happen when they get out, because there aren't jobs, and because they can't get jobs, it will delay the age of marriage, and that's when you'll see anger.
So go on then. You're saying Saudi Arabia is going to change in 10 years, but not because of women's rights, because of economic rights?
I think it'll be economic, and I think it'll be a very slow process. I think that's the way it works. It'll be a slow process.
It's interesting to watch the Saudi media, for instance. Look at the Arabiya, for example, which is competing with Al Jazeera and cheering on the revolutions throughout the Arab world and standing up for the people and their rights and so on. And that should encourage or should motivate Saudis to reform from within. I think we need to leave them at their own pace. Because Saudi Arabia is a very particular case because of the holy places and so on. So it isn't as straightforward like Libya or Tunisia.
But who defines what their own pace
no
is?
One. Well, the Saudis.
Yeah, but those Saudis have very different views on what that pace should be.
Well, speaking to Saudis from all sorts of persuasions and walks, and I mean I was very stunned when I spoke to some liberal Saudis, and they said that the system that we have in here must not be changed. We need to keep it because this is the way that we are kept together.
But many of those people are calling for a constitutional monarchy publicly. I mean, there's been 2 major petitions this year calling for a constitutional monarchy. So maybe that's not an outright change of system.
Well, it is a minority who are calling for this, but this might catch on. We don't know.
I don't see why we.
This is why it's interesting.
I don't see why we have to play ball, and I think that for example, we saw with the Bush administrations war in Iraq, there were slight ripple effects that happened through the region, and for Saudi Arabia to have municipal elections, or you have the first female broadcasters on the news, that's big stuff there in Saudi Arabia. So I wouldn't say maintain, respect them because they have the religious rights. And I also don't subscribe to a moral equivalence. And it sounds arrogant, perhaps it is arrogant, but coming from the West that respects liberal human rights, we are superior societies to those that don't. And therefore we shouldn't respect regimes or societies that fail to embrace basic human rights and liberal values.
How superior are we?
Very.
Well, this is.
This
is very controversial. Yes. Well, again,
radicalization. That's what born the radicalization. Because
again, to claim.
Okay, we'll just take a quick comment from everyone who's
exactly this belief that we're a superior society actually really radicalized people, because we don't understand. I think our belief that we're a superior society actually radicalize people in poor countries or people which don't see. We don't understand them, then we're forcing our society on them. And they have no other option just to believe in God, in
why
something
should I
which
have
belongs.
empathy towards people that
Because
seek
you don't understand
to deny
them.
women's rights, that seek to persecute homosexuals, that speak about infidels, whether they be Christians or Jews? These are that are repressive in every sense of the word. There is no reason why I should be respecting them.
No, you don't need to respect that part, but we don't need to force our culture on them, because we don't want they to force our culture on them.
There's a gentleman over there that said they want over there what we have over here. We're not doing any imposition.
No, I think it's actually what he said. It's you're playing to the hands of the extremists when you say we are superior, we are better than you are, and obviously there are lots of people over there who say, well, stuff you know.
In a society where you have freedom of choice and when your autonomy and rationality is respected, is that not superior to a society that denies you that? Well, yes or no? No fudging. This isn't international law.
But the society doesn't deny you that. Right. Let's break it down. Let's break it down. Panel, will you respond to this controversy first? We'll come to you down in the front.
Well, I'm just going to steal his comments, I think, when saying you were talking about the regime, not about the society.
I agree.
I think, there are many very brave women's activists and human rights activists in the Arab world that are literally risking their lives.
I mean, well, I'm conflating societies with regimes incorrectly. You're right. I'm talking about regimes. Our governments then are superior to those regimes.
Right, now let's go around the room on this. Is your question about superiority of values, either of you? Yes?
Yes. Seems to me that there's a lack of historical perspective in that statement, because it's only very, very recently that one could have made these claims. The history of the British Empire, for example, I don't think would substantiate that argument, so I'm highly sceptical. I'd like to say lots of things about other aspects of it, if I may, just very briefly. It seems to me that the whole discussion here is a little too narrow. Someone did mention about the New World Order, and that, of course, is a relevant factor. I think there's an enormous amount of hypocrisy. The idea that we are only there for humanitarian reasons, it just doesn't stack up. It is continuing the historical imperialist Western attempt to control the resources of these regions and countries, which is which is the underlying thing, and it is only overlaid by some genuine concern for human rights. And the final point, gentleman there, whose name I didn't catch because I came in late, was talking about human rights earlier on, and surely that is the precise link between all these disparate countries and regimes and so on. If we're talking about human rights, then that is the crucial thing which we should be applying universally.
Right, and just keep the microphone if you would. Would you have gone into Libya to say Benghazi was about to be shelled? That's what people think when the airstrikes struck. Are you supporting the airstrikes?
Quite frankly, I don't know. I hate the idea of humanitarian rights being preserved by bombing and killing other people, even though those other people are not very pleasant themselves. Yeah. And I'm not really sure whether there was an alternative, though because I'm not sufficient of an expert. I feel that there ought to be an alternative.
So,
the International Criminal Court, for example, it was mentioned once, and if the leaders had been very clearly indicted to appear before the International Criminal Court, I think that might have deterred some of the actions.
Okay, and to you at the back?
Yeah, just following on from the superiority of societies, I'd imagine that in Mr. Seamer's superior society we've done away with all retards based on his earlier comments. But I'm just curious to know how the panel reconciles themselves with the fact that all of us, based on our pensions, etc., benefit from companies such as BAE Systems.
Right, so arms sales is supporting a broader economy in our country?
Yes, pretty much everyone's pension.
Okay, so we're coming to you with next, and you next, but we'll just answer this gentleman's question. the arms sale question. We're here to ask about foreign policy. I've got some figures here. Bahrain, assault rifles, components for combat aircraft, small arms ammunition, submachines, guns, weapon sights, aircraft cannon, shotguns, rifles, sniper rifles, hand grenades, smoke hand grenades, stun grenades, smoke ammunition, smoke canisters, tear gas and riot control agents sold by the UK to Bahrain between January 2009 and September 2010. Were we right to sell them those, Faraj?
I don't know. I didn't think the democratic governments should sell weapons to undemocratic governments.
That's a lobby. Bigger lobby. Who should we sell it?
Well, so this is the gentleman's question. He's still got the topic. Who should we sell them to?
Sell them to us, the rebels.
Well, Saudi Arabia buys quite a lot, doesn't it? I mean, it keeps BAE, a lot of BAE jobs going. So yes, it's just part of our interests, and I think we will continue to sell arms. And
I'll just make a parenthetical.
Alternatives. Yeah, as an engineer.
Yes, all right. Fine. You can. That's a philosophical. That's a different issue. But we can get into that. But it's.
I'm going to only make a parenthetical point, and your question does imply superiority, because you have a great consciousness of who we in the West sell weapons to, but you make no mention of the fact that Libya and Syria have Russian-owned weapons, and perhaps you take it for granted that these autocratic regimes will be receiving weapons from more repressive regimes. Perhaps you take it for granted that you're not applying that question universally.
Like one thing,
sell them or somebody else will.
No, I'm not going further than that.
Jane?
No leaps of thoughts.
I mean, you mentioned the arms sales to Bahrain. I know the UK government has revoked over 40 arms licences because of the way that some of those weapons have been used in Bahrain. I would still ask what exactly they thought that things like tear gas were going to be used for.
What do you think they would be used for? If they'd rung you up, what would you have
pretty
said?
obvious. I mean, Bahrain does... Some of its weapons purchases are clearly designed against a potential threat from Iran. For example, it bought a huge missile defence system from Lockheed Martin a couple of years ago. Where you're looking at riot control equipment, that is more clearly designed for use against internal protests, which they've had a lot of over recent years.
And for people who are interested in foreign policy, the gentleman's question, he doesn't like the arms trade, but is it part of our national interest to sell arms? Is that a relevant question?
I'm quite sceptical about it, about the pure economic benefits. I don't quite know how it stacks up when you take into account the kind of subsidies, the cost of lobbying overseas for arms sales, etc. I mean, I think basically when governments such as the Gulf governments are buying arms for the UK, part of what they're doing is actually buying political influence. Often they're buying arms that are not realistically going to be used, but essentially they become very important markets, sources of British jobs and so on, and that helps them to buy some influence.
Isn't it ironic that those autocratic governments are supplied arms by democratic governments? I mean, in the last 2 or 3 weeks, Gaddafi has received Israeli weaponry via a Palestinian middleman.
Right.
Which is very interesting.
To you first, then you.
Can I just ask the panel? I think the crux of the problem seems to be that it seems to the people in the Middle East that the only options are either being a pariah state, anti-Western like Iran, or having leaders who are regarded as stooges of the West. Whereas I think what they want, and I think what this whole movement shows, is that they actually want a genuine democratic state that is not backed up by the West, that is not a dictatorship. They just want a plain, simple democracy. And the problem is that they can't trust the West. They can't believe that the West genuinely wants democracy there, because historically they've shown that, for example, in Iran, when there was a democracy, Mossadegh, they toppled him, and they replaced him with the Shah. So basically, what is it that the West can do, if anything, to actually aid genuine democracy in the West? And do they really want democracy?
Which country are you talking about here?
Iran.
So the question is, it's a great question, if I may say, I wish I'd stolen it from you. What can the West do to aid genuine democracy in the Middle East? That's your question. Let's start with you, Jane. Let's hear an answer from everyone to that question, then you're next.
I think the transitions in Tunisia and Egypt are potentially a great opportunity for the West to offer genuine support to real democratic transitions, both through providing some measures of political support, training, legal advice, etc., help finding the assets, perhaps economic support. Debt relief's already been mentioned, but there seems in Egypt to be particular demand for investment and for guarantees, underwriting of investments that would create jobs. Jobs is going to be absolutely key to Egypt's success. I do very much hope that Western policymakers do take that opportunity and don't decide that they fear the Muslim Brotherhood so much that they would prefer to support another kind of disguised military government. I think the question about what the West can do to support democracy in Iran is much harder because clearly the main strategy the regime used to try to discredit protesters in the past in terms of narratives and propaganda was to say that it was all British plus American plus Israeli conspiracy. So I think that, I'm not an Iran specialist, but I think there is a big question around whether Western support for alternative movements in Iran does them any good at all.
I think that, first of all, I wouldn't be supportive of democratisation, I'd be supportive of liberalisation. That was the flaw of the Bush administration, because democratisation is a culmination of a multi-generational process. Start with liberalisation. Bernard Lewis had the most fascinating interview in the Wall Street Journal when he spoke about how classical Islam had a system of consultations, that in Arabic there's no word for democracy, they have justice and they have consultations. And why should we impose a Western-style democracy on the Middle East? And there doesn't need to necessarily be a clash of civilizations if consultations are working in sync with Western democracies. I think we should be funding opposition groups, not having the minimal funds that the Bush administration did, which was slashed by the Obama administration. So we should be doing a lot more to foster liberalisation by funding opposition groups. And I wouldn't have a problem with regime change itself, simply due to the nuclear threat and their sponsorship of terrorism around the world, not simply the Middle East. I don't think that targeting the regime would cause the opposition to coalesce around the regime in opposition to the West. I don't buy that logic. There is a law of unintended consequences, but that's bizarre, let alone unintended.
No, I think the best thing we do, I agree with Jane, is to look at Egypt. I think there's a real opportunity in Egypt. I know quite a lot of Egyptians, and I've been impressed by the way the older generation, including top generals, have really accepted the fact that, that the revolution has happened. Everybody's now a revolutionary. They mean different things by it, but we have to help them to get through, do what we can to help them to make that concrete, so the constitutional changes, etc. Elsewhere, it's a question of trying to work where we can, where the opportunities come up. A lot, I think, British aid at the moment is directed to things like helping to improve the rule of law, helping parliamentary systems, helping NGOs, etc. This is the sort of thing that can continue. But otherwise, there'll be opportunities that crop up.
But Israel's not a democracy today, is it?
Why?
Why is it? It's run by the army. There's no women running the. There's no women running the country.
Israel.
No, I beg your pardon. I'm Egypt.
Egypt.
Sorry.
Oh, I know controversy.
Egypt.
Yes, but there are plenty of women in Egyptian politics.
That's actually a good question for now. We will obviously have to come to Israel.
No, there are.
Egypt's not a democracy now, is it?
No, it's going towards it. It's going towards it, and it's going to require. It'll be several years, I think.
I'm leaving you out for this. Did you get an answer to your question there?
I was going to say, just very briefly in response to that, the problem is that as soon as the West is funding any opposition groups, there's no trust. You don't trust them to have genuine intentions. You think they're going to be a stooge, they have an agenda. And I think they've lost the trust of the people, and it's a question of regaining the trust.
I think they never had the trust of the people because regimes were always inculcating the masses against external enemies in order to legitimise their rule. If you actually see what's happened with the oppositions in Egypt, for example, you've not heard really any anti-Western rhetoric from the
we'll come back to
protesters. That's striking.
Move on. Man in tie, then woman at back.
Thank you. My name is Hossam. I'm from Egypt, and my comment is on the superiority point. I think it's naive to burden foreign policy with the need to be moral. Foreign policy is practical. Yes. The reason that your comments on superiority annoy people is I think that there's an element of truth to them and painful truth. Western, or let's call them democratic countries, walk the tightrope between having to be practical on foreign policy, but also represent their people's morality. In the Middle East, that has not really been the case because it's not been in the regime's interest to act always morally. It is precisely that disconnect that made us take to the streets and remove Mubarak and be prepared to run into tear gas and rubber bullets and all the rest of it. And if I have to close on a question, let me ask this. Why are you waiting for Middle Eastern consensus on Libya? You're not going to get it. I mean, it's not in the regime's interests to overthrow anybody because then they're next. But there is a disconnect between what the regimes want and what their people want.
And does the woman who asked the question before you, do millions of people in the Middle East have a problem with what you've just said? In other words, say one thing and mean completely the other. Talk about democracy but mean our interests. Talk about human rights but mean trade. Is that all, that's what you want us to do? You just be honest about it.
I think you would get a much more respectful reaction from the Middle East if you pursued your interests honestly. Not you, obviously.
On a less cynical tone, Bernard Lewis would say that they're not looking for interests; they're looking for justice. They want to have, they want to be included in processes and decision-making processes, and they want to just be able to buy food. That's basic justice.
And to you at the back.
Jenny Taylor from Lapido Media. As I understand it, liberalisation, you mean the liberalisation of freedom of conscience and freedom of speech, the kinds of things that are the basis of democracy. Why does this government not do what America did in 1998 and introduce a Freedom of Religion Act that has to be observed in all giving of aid and all trade agreements? Why, for example, in Pakistan have we given 450 million in grants to Pakistan without any conditionality on freedom of conscience?
I don't know how the law in question works, but certainly the US is content to be selling $60 billion worth of arms to Saudi Arabia, where freedom of religion is not even pretended to be practiced.
Well, it's obviously a slow process, but you've got to start. You've got to start.
It's obviously a very big figure, isn't it? That's
but the direction.
But it's better to have an act than no act at all.
OK, well, thank you for raising it. I'm going to start moving us on, if I may. Noel, did you want to comment on the lady's remark?
No, I was going to say that the US does actually produce every year a report on this. It certainly names Saudi Arabia amongst other countries for their religious freedom. OK, so we've got about 10 minutes left, and we're coming to you next. To you now.
Can I just ask you to make a distinction what you mean between promoting liberalisation and democracy? And if you look at the societies in places like Egypt and Libya, you are looking at quite liberalised communities and societies. Another point which you mentioned about...
OK, let's just break... That's fine. What's the difference between liberalisation and democratisation?
Democratisation is active participation. It's just the oversimplistic version. Democratisation is active participation in a process. Liberalisation is freedom from government exposure. A phenomenal book that I read very recently, and I wish I would have read it a decade ago, was Fareed Zakaria's Future of Freedom, where he actually does speak about the distinction between liberalisation and democratisation, and this was something that the Bush administration clearly didn't understand.
Yeah, OK, can I just pick up on another point that you made about what the West can do to promote this? You mentioned the nuclear threat in the Middle East, and I think it's quite clear everyone understands who the biggest nuclear threat in the Middle East is and has been for several decades. Israel, obviously. The second point that I wanted to make, as a gesture, obviously the communities there and the populations there, after reaching such a stage by their revolutions, looking to the West and what they want to offer, they want to see actual tangible steps being taken. So, for example, how do you look at the assets that have been frozen by the Western governments of the corrupt regimes, and nothing has been done about them? The people you talk about justice, the people are looking for those
Okay. There's a huge meal there. You're worth an evening on your own. So, I mean, bear with me though. Can you take the question of Israel nuclear? Jane, can you take the question of frozen assets? And then we're coming to you.
Well, obviously, the Israeli democracy isn't a good example to emulate in the Middle East. Obviously, there is a serious problem with a country that occupies a good number of people and denies them the rights to be free. So Israel isn't a good example at all to look at. But when it comes to democracy in the Middle East, I think we wanted to democratize ourselves, okay, according to our beliefs, cultures, and our own pace. So it isn't going to be exactly a Western democracy. Democracy is different in this country from the democracy that we have in America when it comes to participation, the political system, and so on. So, you know, we need to do it on our own terms rather than in your terms.
I think this point about the assets is really important. I mean, I think people have heard a lot of words in the Middle East, and they do want to see actions from the West that proves that the West is going to support these transitions. I imagine that there will be some kind of lobbying against such actions, because London is a financial centre where a lot of people that are not democratic are stashing their assets, and probably you would find people in the city arguing, hey, if they don't come here, they'll go to Liberia or Switzerland or somewhere else. But I do think politically this is something that the West should pursue and can pursue. I hope that they do.
Hi, thank you for taking my question. I'm Cindy Macedo from the Kensington Chelsea Women's Club. It's an international women's club. I'd like to address my question to Jane from Chatham House and also the gentleman from Benghazi. Okay, granted that because of something that came out in the WikiLeaks State Department documents, tuna leaks became a big influence in the turning of the people in Tunisia. Did you expect that this was going to happen in Libya? Did you, in the Chatham House, know that this was going to happen like dominoes? And why weren't the intelligence of the United Kingdom, of the United States, prepared? I mean, they don't seem to be prepared. Why was everybody taken by surprise all of a sudden?
I think probably nobody a year ago would have predicted a revolution in Tunisia. The possibility of a revolution in Egypt was certainly already being discussed, both by intelligence and by the many businesses that exist in the country, because there was already a concern about the presidential succession. But Tunisia, no. A colleague of mine from my previous job, the Economist Intelligence Unit, was in Tunisia in early December, meeting
with the French cabinet.
Meeting with opposition parties who didn't expect a revolution to happen. This is one of the most heavily under surveillance societies in the Middle East, with a real police state. So the revolution, in a way, was only successful because people didn't know about it, because this wasn't the traditional opposition movements. This was something that organised in a different way, and therefore wasn't stopped by Tunisian intelligence. But I think there is a lot of uncertainty now within Western policy circles about what this all means and where they go next.
But do you agree that WikiLeaks had provoked what happened in Tunisia?
I don't, actually. I think it's more people's everyday experience of corruption, where they were expected to be bribing the police on a routine basis. I think WikiLeaks probably confirmed to people what they already knew.
Well, in the Libyan situation, I didn't think that WikiLeaks has any role to play in it. But interestingly enough, the Libyan revolution was due to start in the 17th by youngsters, people who use Facebook, Twitter, and so on. But actually started in the 15th by women, by Arab women, who came out at night, 10 o'clock at night, when they heard that the lawyer who was representing their loved ones who were massacred in the Abu Silim prison back in 1996, and they just took it upon themselves. They came out in the middle of the night, around 10 o'clock at night, and they headed for the security headquarters, and they freed the man, actually, Fathi Turbil, who's the lawyer, and as they walked with him, they just chanted for Benghazi to come out, and the revolution started. And this is something we are really proud of.
I have questions about Israel, or what's so-called Israeli democracy. If we take on board that Israel is the democratic island or democratic oasis in the desert of tyranny and dictatorship today, if tomorrow the Arab world becomes democratic and liberal, how can we look at Israel by then?
Okay, but you two in the middle.
I think that if the Arab world became democratic tomorrow, there'd be the heightened chance of peace between Israel and its neighbours. Currently, Israel has no
way. As long as Israel has the Palestinian question unanswered, there will be no peace.
But why would the Israelis have confidence in making peace with any Arab leader who are here today and possibly not here tomorrow? We know, for example, that Mubarak, he had a 30-year cold peace with Israel, right? And
because
now let me finish my point.
Okay, briefly.
Now we see that the future leadership isn't really embracing the peace treaty with Israel. So there's a distinction.
Well, I did think there would be peace with Israel as long as Israel behaves the way it behaves. I mean, now we've seen the last act that the Israeli parliament has just passed by withdrawing nationality from the Arab Israelis for being accused of being pro-terrorist or whatever. No. I didn't think this is going to go forward.
Yes, I mean, I think, as I say, it's not the question of democracy or not. It's the actual issues, I think, will be the important thing. Yeah.
A previous Israeli president was sentenced to prison, right, by an Israeli Arab judge for sexual harassment. Where would you see that in the Arab world?
He's a rapist.
Where would you see that?
He should be stoned to death, to me.
We'll start with the panel.
I was going to say is that, I mean, answer the point earlier, I mean, the peace treaty with Israel was signed by Sadat and maintained by Mubarak, and I'm pretty sure the army, it's such a strategic issue for Egypt. It may change eventually, but it won't change. And the peace treaty with Jordan was signed by King Hussein and been maintained by King Abdullah. So you can have changes of leaders, and it continues.
The audience is very interested in discussing Israel, so let's make 5 minutes, and then we're ending after this 5 minutes. What challenges are there for Israel from this Arab Spring and the West's response to it?
I think the loss of Mubarak has been a big shock to Israel. I think there is a good argument that peace between peoples is better and more sustainable, but the idea of that happening tomorrow is also going to be extremely difficult. So far, I don't see an indication that you might imagine this would be a time for Israel to move more rapidly to a peace agreement. I don't see an indication that the Sikh government is keen to do that. I think that the issue of democracy is a bit of a red herring, because I think Israel is a democratic country in itself, obviously not in the occupied territories, but democracy clearly doesn't solve all the problems. I think that, in fact, the relationship with Egypt is unlikely to change very dramatically for the time being, especially with the Egyptian military still in charge. I do think if we see a continued heating up of the tensions in Gaza, that could be quite a serious flashpoint.
No, I think one effect will be it'll mean that Israel has to deal with the regime, with the people, the whole government, the whole society, rather than regimes. It's one thing to do a peace treaty, and to help your point, with a leader, but they'll now have to much harder to persuade parliaments and people and public opinion to back it, which will require changes in Israel's policy, I think.
Okay, new question, and we're cantering to a conclusion. Mine with glasses.
Yeah, okay, I had a few comments, actually. I'm from Tunisia, Omar Ben Yedda, so...
welcome.
Thank you.
You know the saying, it's ironic the Egyptians are walking like Tunisians. You've heard that before, haven't you?
But a few points. Number one, about Libya. Actually, people mentioned oil. Yeah, possibly oil may be a consideration, but Western companies were doing quite well under Gaddafi, so I don't think oil was as big a part as people may think or imply. Secondly, we were actually very happy in Tunisia that there was no foreign intervention, and we were happy that the French made foreign policy mistakes during the revolution to actually claim that it was our revolution and that no one would have the upper hand on what we were going to do. Saying that, I would like to tell my Libyan friend that post-revolution, actually the vacuum created has created a lot of uncertainty, and I'm confident, although I know that some of my Tunisian friends are less confident, but we saw a lot of solidarity, we saw a lot of organisation, but then we also saw a lot of chaos a few weeks after the revolution. So it's a lot harder than what it appears. And one of the problems with actual foreign policy, I feel that in the UK, we're not... I said I'm actually I'm British passport and Tunisian, so I see UK foreign policy as partly my foreign policy, but I find that there's a big naivety about and lack of knowledge about the societies which we're entering in terms of foreign policy. Okay. And my actually comment about Israel, just one very simple comment: the Arab street. So it's more importantly, because if we are going to free the Arab street want justice. So in terms of foreign policy, I think they'll be a lot less clement than the regimes are with Israel at the moment.
And would you just admit, were you surprised at what happened in Tunisia?
Oh, we were all surprised at what happened in Tunisia. And what happened in Tunisia wasn't about WikiLeaks, and it wasn't about Al Jazeera. Okay. It was about the people, actually.
Thanks very much. So, panel, can you now give us your closing thoughts and answer this question as well? Given everything you've said tonight, one of the first questions on the website that everyone paid £10 for to get in, I might add, was how much of an influence can the West expect to have now in the Middle East? So would you answer that and give us your closing thoughts in a couple of minutes each, and then we'll all let you go?
I think Western influence in the Middle East has been diminished recently. I think the strong Western backing for regimes that have fallen is one problem. I think the economic outlook for the Western countries is also a problem. I think there are a lot of people in the Middle East who are buying into the idea that economic power is shifting more and more towards Asia, and that Europe and the US are kind of will be less important in the world in the future. I think that there is a good opportunity for the West to actually try to stand up for the values it claims to have around democracy and human rights, and that could make perhaps the US and Europe more attractive allies than a China that, for instance, doesn't care about these things. But that will depend on a lot of policy changes from the Western governments. I'm not yet certain that we are going to see these things happen.
I think that it's much easier to encourage the instigation of revolution, change, regime change. It's much harder to, in a sustained manner, engage with opposition groups and foster change. I think this is one of the reasons why in Yemen the United States sought to have a dereliction of its responsibility and just rely on the president rather than seek opposition groups that it could engage in for sustainable change. And I think that rather than relying on short-term stability, we should be focused on a much more long-term transformational approach and, in turn, foster liberalisation. Let's not go for the ballot boxes yet. Yeah. Multi-generational process.
I think the specific issue of Yemen, it was a focus on Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and the terrorist threat, which has perhaps distorted people's assessment of what the real problems in Yemen were. All I really would say at the end is what I said at the beginning. Foreign policy is essentially a mixture of interest and values, practicality and resources, allies, a consensus of people in the region. And I think we cannot think that what we've seen in Tunisia and Egypt will necessarily be repeated in that way in the other countries in the region. I think we're going to see a lot of different scenarios and different trajectories, and in some places it'll be very, very slow.
And a lot of different responses from the West.
Different responses. And it's also worth remembering, no one's mentioned it, there is actually a sort of reasonably freely elected parliament in Kuwait, which has been functioning for the last 20 years. So there are examples of where it's happening.
Lebanon as well.
And Lebanon, yes.
I think the Arab world is going to be democratic. Democracy is reigning throughout the Arab world, and I think the discourse of superiority and the language of diktat from the West, I think this has to finish now, because now it's people dealing with people, and we will be electing our own representative rather than having despotic regimes imposed on us and sustained by the West. The other important thing, I think, it's a unique opportunity to strike a strategic partnership between the Middle East and Europe, because we are neighbors, but also we have plenty to give to each other.
And there's one piece of unfinished business business. I cut you off halfway through, and I wonder if you, because this is a meeting devoted to the audience, would you have the final question or word? Because we've got 2 minutes left.
Just a half comment. Sorry, just a half comment. I'm Libyan. First, about the foreign intervention in Libya. I don't think it will happen in other country because Gaddafi started the foreign intervention, and the Libyan people ask UN to help them. So it's a backward story. It's not straightforward case. This first. Second, about the democracy in history in Libya. Yes, we have democracy and we try. First republic in Middle East and Third World, it was in Libya, 1918, in Tripolitania. So this is a very important point. About blaming the West, I don't think we should blame the West because dealing with dictatorship, because they are protecting their interest. And I hope my country one day will protect our interest and deal with everybody the same way. About Israel and if it's open, Israel, yes, open for peace. Peace or prize, I'm Libyan to say that. That's why they're supporting Gaddafi and selling weapons. And that's why the Minister of Defense refused to answer a question how Israel involving and intervening with Gaddafi.
Just to rejoin to, I've heard you both echo each other on this point. I've just not seen a source anywhere, and I'd be very appreciative if you
We've seen weapons that has Israeli scripts and the Star of David and so on.
Okay, let's. This question really needs to be its own topic. I know people in the audience want us to go on, but you'll have to do it after the meeting closes because it's 8:29. We started a minute late. We're going to end a minute early, and that's just the rules. But I'd like to thank the panel very much indeed. I'm sorry if your whole area of specialty has been reduced to minutes at a time, but listening to you, I've learned a lot. I enjoyed the arguments, and I know it's not finished. But we came in to discuss foreign policy. We've heard it debated. We came in for a briefing on specific countries. You've all told us, don't just put them together, Syria, Yemen, Bahrain. Treat them as their own. That was a very important message, and you've got to tell us that as well. So thank you very much. And to you as well, everyone in the audience, thank you very much indeed.